These are the aircraft that flew where satellites couldn't reach and where human agents couldn't go, gathering the secrets that prevented World War III. Early reconnaissance aircraft. Boeing RB-47 Drachetidaire. Take a B-47 bomber, strip out the bombs, and pack it with cameras and electronic intelligence gear. That's how American reconnaissance started in the jet age. The RB-47 flew along Soviet borders, sometimes deliberately crossing into their airspace to provoke radar activation so they could map air defense systems. It was incredibly dangerous work. In 1960, an RB-47 was shot down over the Barents Sea by a Soviet MiG-19. 2 crew members died, and 4 were captured and held prisoner. These missions weren't glamorous spy flights. They were tense operations where crews knew Soviet fighters were hunting them. The RB-47 could fly high and fast, but not high or fast enough to be invulnerable. It gathered crucial intelligence about Soviet bomber bases and radar networks throughout the 1950s. English Electric Canberra, PR.9. Britain's high-altitude photo-reconnaissance version of the Canberra bomber, and it was brilliant. The PR.9 could reach 60,000 feet, far higher than standard jet fighters could intercept in the 1950s. RAF Canberras flew covert missions over Eastern Europe and Soviet territory, photographing military installations with remarkable clarity. The aircraft was so successful that the U.S. licensed it as the Martin B-57 and created their own reconnaissance variants. British Canberra crews conducted some of the first overflights of Soviet nuclear test sites, providing crucial intelligence about USSR atomic weapons development. The PR.9 proved that Britain could still play in the reconnaissance game, despite limited resources. Lockheed RF-80, Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter converted for reconnaissance. The RF-80 served in Korea, conducting low-level photo reconnaissance missions over enemy territory. It was fast enough to evade most ground fire and could photograph targets with surprising detail. These missions were terrifying, flying low and fast over anti-aircraft guns with no weapons to fight back. RF-80 pilots earned their pay every single mission, bringing back intelligence that shaped UN strategy. The RF-80 represented the transition from propeller reconnaissance to the jet age. High-altitude spy planes. Lockheed U-2, the legend. Kelly Johnson's Skunk Works created an aircraft that could fly at 70,000 feet, far above any fighter or missile of its era, or so they thought. The U-2 was essentially a powered glider with a jet engine, those long wings giving it incredible altitude capability. CIA pilots flew missions over the Soviet Union from 1956 to 1960, photographing military installations the Soviets thought were hidden. The Soviets knew U-2s were up there. They tracked them on radar, but couldn't reach them. Until May 1st, 1960, when Gary Powers was shot down by an SA-2 missile. The incident was a massive embarrassment. Eisenhower was caught in lies about the mission, and the summit with Khrushchev collapsed. But here's the thing, the U-2 kept flying. It operated over Cuba during the missile crisis, over Vietnam, over China. Upgraded U-2s still fly today, over 60 years later, because sometimes you need eyes directly overhead that satellites can't provide. The U-2 proved that high altitude was survivable until it wasn't, and then proved it again. Lockheed TR-1. Essentially a U-2 with upgraded sensors and a new designation. The TR-1 was developed in the 1980s for battlefield surveillance, using advanced radar to track Warsaw Pact forces in Eastern Europe. It could fly along the border between East and West Germany, its radar looking deep into communist territory without crossing the line. The TR-1 represented a shift from strategic reconnaissance over enemy territory to standoff surveillance from safe airspace. Eventually, the designation was dropped, and they just called them all U-2s again. but the TR-1 showed reconnaissance was evolving beyond just cameras. Lockheed SR-71. Blackbird. The most beautiful aircraft ever built, and possibly the most capable. The SR-71 could fly at Mach 3.2 and 85,000 feet, faster and higher than any operational interceptor. When missiles were fired at it, the Blackbird simply accelerated and outran them. Over 4,000 missiles were fired at SR-71s, none ever hit. The aircraft leaked fuel on the ground because titanium panels expanded at temperature, gaps sealed only when friction heating at Mach 3 made the airframe expand. Pilots wore pressure suits like astronauts because at that altitude, your blood boils if the cockpit depressurizes. The SR-71 flew missions over North Vietnam, the Middle East, and along Soviet borders. It photographed denied territory and intercepted electronic signals. When the Cold War ended, the SR-71 was retired, then brought back briefly, then retired again. Nothing has replaced it. The Blackbird represented the absolute peak of manned reconnaissance technology, an aircraft so advanced it looked futuristic decades after it was built. Lockheed A-12 Oxcart. The SR-71's predecessor, and actually faster. The A-12 was CIA's single-seat reconnaissance aircraft, flying even more sensitive missions than the Air Force's SR-71. Only 15 were built, and they operated in complete secrecy. A-12s flew missions over North Vietnam and North Korea, gathering intelligence from places too dangerous for other aircraft. When one crashed in 1963, the CIA went to extraordinary lengths to hide what it was. The A-12 was slightly faster than the SR-71, reaching Mach 3.35, but carried less equipment. It represented the CIA's parallel program to the Air Force, both agencies wanting the best reconnaissance capability. Strategic Reconnaissance Aircraft. Boeing RC-135. The workhorse of American electronic reconnaissance, and it's still flying today. The RC-135 family includes dozens of variants, each specialized for different intelligence missions. Some intercept communications, some map radar systems, some monitor telemetry from missile tests. RC-135s flew along Soviet borders throughout the Cold War, their crews listening to everything the Soviets transmitted. These missions were boring for hours, then terrifying when Soviet fighters intercepted them, sometimes aggressively. In 1969, a North Korean MiG shot down an EC-121 over international waters, killing 31 Americans. RC-135s gather so much intelligence that crews joke they know more about Soviet military than Soviet generals did. The aircraft may look like a boring 707 airliner, but the electronics inside cost more than the airplane itself. Boeing E-8 Joint Stars. Designed late in the Cold War, but operational just in time for Desert Storm. Joint Stars carried massive radar that could track ground vehicles across an entire battlefield, watching Soviet tank formations from hundreds of miles away. The system could distinguish between wheeled and tracked vehicles, identify convoys, and direct airstrikes in real time. Joint Stars represented reconnaissance, merging with command and control, not just gathering intelligence, but directing forces based on it. Myasishchev M55. The Soviet attempt to match the U-2, arriving decades late. The M55 was a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft with distinctive twin-boom design. It could reach similar altitudes to the U-2, but came into service in the late 1980s when satellites had made strategic overflights less critical. Only a few were built, and after the Cold War, some were converted for scientific research. The M55 showed Soviet determination to match Western capabilities, even when the mission had evolved beyond it. Tactical reconnaissance jets. McDonnell RF-4 Phantom II. Take the ultimate multi-role fighter and turn it into a reconnaissance platform. The RF-4 had a longer nose packed with cameras and sensors, no gun, and the mission was get in, photograph, get out. RF-4s operated over Vietnam at high and low altitude, photographing targets before and after strikes. They flew over Europe, ready to photograph Soviet forces if war came. The RF-4 was fast enough to survive, tough enough to take battle damage, and versatile enough to serve dozens of nations. Some flew into the 21st century, proof that the basic design was sound. Phantom reconnaissance crews earned their pay in the most dangerous skies, unarmed and relying purely on speed and electronics to survive. Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-25R, the reconnaissance variant of the infamous Foxbat interceptor, and it was remarkable. The MiG-25R could fly at Mach 2.8 and 80,000 feet, carrying cameras that photographed from the edge of space. Israeli pilots reported MiG-25Rs overflying Israel, and they couldn't intercept them. The Foxbat was simply too high and too fast. Egypt operated MiG-25Rs during the Yom Kippur War, conducting reconnaissance. Israel couldn't stop. The MiG-25R proved that Soviet aerospace engineering could match American technology. Its combination of speed and altitude made it nearly invulnerable, and reconnaissance variants served far longer than the interceptor versions. Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-21. The reconnaissance version of the ubiquitous MiG-21 fighter, carrying cameras in a centerline pod. The MiG-21R was fast, small, and agile, perfect for low-level tactical reconnaissance. Warsaw Pact forces deployed hundreds, ready to photograph NATO positions in a European war. The MiG-21R traded dogfighting ability for intelligence gathering, but retained enough performance to survive hostile airspace. It represented Soviet philosophy. Take a successful fighter, modify it for reconnaissance, build it in large numbers. Sukhoi Su-24. A reconnaissance variant of the Fencer strike aircraft, designed for tactical reconnaissance deep in enemy territory. The Su-24MR could fly low and fast, using terrain masking to avoid radar, then pop up to photograph targets. Its sophisticated navigation systems allowed precise positioning, even without GPS. The Su-24MR represented late Cold War Soviet capability. All-weather, day-night reconnaissance, using advanced sensors. Dassault Mirage 4. France's strategic bomber, but some were configured for reconnaissance. The Mirage 4 could fly at Mach 2, carrying cameras or electronic intelligence gear. French independence required indigenous reconnaissance capability, and the Mirage 4 provided it. These aircraft could photograph Soviet installations or monitor Warsaw Pact exercises without relying on American intelligence. The Mirage 4 represented French determination to maintain strategic autonomy. North American RF-86 Sabre. Early in the Cold War, reconnaissance Sabres flew dangerous missions over North Korea and along communist borders. The RF-86 retained the fighter's performance, but carried cameras instead of guns. These missions were incredibly risky, flying into hostile territory with no weapons. RF-86 pilots relied on speed and luck, knowing that one encounter with MiGs could be fatal. English Electric Canberra, B.2. Beyond the high-altitude PR.9, standard Canberra bombers were modified for low-level reconnaissance. These aircraft flew dangerous missions photographing targets that high-altitude platforms couldn't see clearly. British Canberras operated worldwide, providing reconnaissance for Commonwealth forces and NATO allies. Electronic intelligence aircraft. Lockheed EC-121, Warning Star. Based on the Super Constellation airliner, the EC-121 carried massive radar and electronic intelligence gear. These aircraft orbited off Soviet and Chinese coasts, monitoring radar emissions and communications. The work was tedious, flying long circles for hours, but the intelligence was crucial. When North Korea shot down an EC-121 in 1969, killing 31 Americans, it demonstrated the risks these unarmed reconnaissance aircraft faced. The EC-121 also provided airborne radar coverage over Vietnam, directing fighters to intercepts. Boeing E-3, Sentry, the AWACS, with that distinctive rotating radar dome on top. The E-3 could see hundreds of miles, tracking aircraft and directing fighters. While primarily a command and control aircraft, the Sentry gathered immense intelligence about air operations. NATO E-3s monitored Warsaw Pact exercises, learning Soviet tactics and capabilities. The AWACS represented a revolution in airborne surveillance, able to manage an entire air battle while gathering intelligence simultaneously. Tupolev Tu-95 RTs, the Bear-D reconnaissance variant, specifically designed to find and target NATO carrier battle groups for Soviet anti-ship missiles. The Tu-95 RTs carried powerful radar and could transmit targeting data directly to submarines and ships. NATO carriers were constantly shadowed by Bear-Ds during exercises, practicing for the war that thankfully never came. The Tu-95 RTs represented Soviet naval aviation's reach, able to find carriers 1,000 miles from Soviet bases. Ilyushin Il-20, the Soviet equivalent to the RC-135, based on the Il-18 airliner. The Il-20 bristled with antennas and carried electronic intelligence gear. These aircraft flew along NATO borders, intercepting communications and mapping radar systems. Il-20s monitored NATO exercises, learning tactics and capabilities. The aircraft represented Soviet determination to match Western electronic reconnaissance, though typically with less sophisticated equipment. Ilyushin Il-38, a maritime patrol aircraft with reconnaissance capabilities designed to hunt NATO submarines. The Il-38 carried sonobuoys, radar, and magnetic anomaly detectors. Soviet naval aviation deployed Il-38s worldwide, monitoring Western naval operations. The aircraft could loiter for hours, tracking submarine activity and surface ships. It represented the maritime dimension of Cold War reconnaissance. Douglas EA-3 Sky Warrior, carrier-based electronic reconnaissance, taking Navy's heavy bomber and filling it with intelligence gear. EA-3s flew from carriers, monitoring communist communications and radar. These missions brought reconnaissance to the tactical level, supporting carrier battle groups directly. The EA-3 operated over Vietnam, gathering signals intelligence that shaped American strategy. Maritime Patrol and Reconnaissance. Lockheed P-3, Orion, the submarine hunter that did so much more. The P-3 carried sonobuoys, radar, and magnetic anomaly detectors to find Soviet submarines. But it also carried cameras, electronic intelligence gear, and could conduct surface surveillance. P-3s patrolled vast ocean areas, tracking Soviet naval movements and gathering intelligence. These missions were long, tedious, sometimes lasting 12 hours or more. P-3 crews developed encyclopedic knowledge of Soviet ship types, able to identify vessels by radar signature alone. The Orion represented America's maritime reconnaissance backbone, operating from bases worldwide. Tupolev Tu-95. Bear. The original bomber version also conducted maritime reconnaissance, photographing NATO naval forces and monitoring exercises. Bear reconnaissance variants operated globally, from the Arctic to the Pacific. NATO fighters regularly intercepted Bears near carrier battle groups, watching them circle just outside missile range. The Tu-95's incredible range allowed missions lasting 15 hours or more, crews enduring in cramped, noisy conditions. Bears represented Soviet power projection, able to monitor NATO anywhere. Tupolev Tu-142, a dedicated maritime patrol version of the Bear, specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. The Tu-142 carried sonobuoys, magnetic anomaly detection gear, and torpedoes. Soviet naval aviation deployed Tu-142s to find American ballistic missile submarines, the highest priority reconnaissance target. These aircraft flew from Soviet bases to monitor submarine activity near American coasts. The Tu-142 represented the strategic importance of maritime reconnaissance, finding submarines that carried nuclear weapons. Kawasaki P-2J, Japan's indigenous maritime patrol aircraft, developed from the American P-2 Neptune. The P-2J monitored Soviet naval activity near Japan, particularly watching submarine movements through key straits. Japanese crews became expert at tracking Soviet submarines, gathering intelligence that was shared with the U.S. Navy. The P-2J represented Japan's growing self-defense capability and contribution to Western intelligence gathering. Breguet Atlantic, Europe's collaborative maritime patrol aircraft, operated by France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands. The Atlantic hunted Soviet submarines in the Mediterranean and Atlantic, conducting reconnaissance on Warsaw Pact naval forces. European Atlantics provided NATO with crucial maritime intelligence, tracking submarine deployments and surface combatants. The aircraft represented European cooperation in defense, pooling resources to create capable reconnaissance platforms. Unmanned reconnaissance systems. Ryan Model 147 Lightning Bug, America's early reconnaissance drone, launched from modified C-130s over hostile territory. These drones flew pre-programmed routes over North Vietnam, China, and North Korea, photographing targets too dangerous for manned aircraft. Some were shot down. Others completed their missions and were recovered mid-air by helicopters. The Lightning Bug represented the future. Unmanned reconnaissance reducing risk to air crews. Over 3,400 missions were flown, gathering intelligence from denied areas. The technology was primitive by modern standards, but it worked. Lockheed D-21. One of the strangest reconnaissance systems ever built, a ramjet-powered drone designed to be launched from an S-71 or B-52. The D-21 could fly at Mach 3.3 and photograph deep inside Soviet or Chinese territory. After its mission, the drone ejected its film package for recovery. The program was troubled by crashes and technical problems. Only a handful of missions were flown, mostly over China. The D-21 represented ambitious thinking, combined drone expendability with manned aircraft performance. It didn't work well, but it showed Lockheed's willingness to push boundaries. Tupolev Tu-123, Yastreb, the Soviet reconnaissance drone, essentially a miniature cruise missile with cameras. The Tu-123 was launched from a truck, flew a pre-programmed route at high altitude and supersonic speed, then ejected its film for recovery. Only about 52 were built, and they served through the 1970s. The Tu-123 showed Soviet attempts to develop unmanned reconnaissance, though they never achieved the same success as American programs. Experimental and prototype aircraft. Bell X-16. Designed to compete with the U-2, the X-16 was a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft that never entered service. The Air Force chose Lockheed's U-2 instead, and the X-16 program was canceled after only one prototype was built. It represented the competition to create high-altitude spy planes, where Lockheed won and Bell lost. Lockheed YF-12. The interceptor version of the A-12/SR-71 family, armed with missiles. While not a reconnaissance aircraft, some proposed using it for high-speed reconnaissance missions. The YF-12 set speed and altitude records, proving the basic design's capabilities. Only 3 were built before the program ended, but they influenced SR-71 development. Boeing RC-135 X-Cobra-I, an experimental reconnaissance version testing new sensors and systems. Only one was converted, serving as a testbed for reconnaissance technology. The Cobra-I represented continuous development of RC-135 capabilities, always adding new sensors and techniques. North American XB-70 Valkyrie. While designed as a bomber, the XB-70's Mach 3 capability and altitude made some propose reconnaissance variants. Only 2 were built, both for testing, and the program ended without reconnaissance versions. The XB-70 represented what might have been a massive, incredibly fast reconnaissance platform that technology had moved beyond. Tupolev Tu-128, reconnaissance variant. Some Tu-128 interceptors were reportedly configured for high-speed reconnaissance, using their speed and range for deep penetration missions. The details remain classified, but the Tu-128's capabilities would have made it effective in this role. From U-2s shot down over Russia to SR-71s that never were, spy planes risked crews and international incidents to gather the intelligence that kept Cold War leaders informed and, hopefully, rational enough to avoid nuclear war.